Okay, well, this week we will begin vaYiqra, chapter 25, verse 11. And of course, I'm going to start with verse 10 just by my translation of verse 10 was, and you will consecrate the year, the 50th year, and call out the roar, liberty in the land to all inhabitants. It will be a Yovel, and they call that Jubilee. And you will return a man's ahuzah, his property, his possessions to him. And a man will be returned to his. Kind of going to have two meanings there. One, if a man has been forced into indentured servitude. Do we remember that? Somebody gotten a lot of debt, owes a lot of money, and now he's been forced to go work that debt off. That person will be returned to his family. He won't. The debt will be paid at this point, regardless of whatever's left over, if any. The other thing that happens there is it's saying that people who have lost any part of their possession, their house, their land, their cloak, whatever, that person's going to be returned to all of that. It's basically saying that the person will be returned to his inheritance because your home and your land and all that was inherited. Okay. The possessions that a child of God leases, he does not sell, to another child of God is still considered the original person's property because he leased it. He did not sell it. See, in the English translation of the Bible, sometimes words change meaning over time. And whether sale had more of a lease connotation back when the English versions were coming out, 1611 in particular, is possible. For instance, the books of that time period said that God was a jealous God. Well, because back then, a jealous God was a zealous God, someone who's excited about his people. But where the idea of a jilted lover comes in is eventually, language in its primitive form will take one word that maybe means blessing, like barach, but that word can also mean cursing. And there's a lot of other ideas like bending the knee. That's how you tell someone to bend down on your knees. You say barach. These words are used in a lot of different ways. Well, as time has gone on, in particular in the Western world, we've just come up with new words to replace, instead of saying one word like barach and having all these different meanings, we came up with new words: blessing, cursing, bending the knee. We came up with all these new things. And even so, as time has gone on, our use of these words begins to change. And so the idea that the King James or whoever else is wrong is not really accurate. They were probably the right words to use in that time period, but not now, because we don't use those words the same way. And I've said it before, I think it's funny, it's very crude, but I had a stepdad that used to, the buddies would all be over and standing around drinking their beer, watching him work on one of their cars. And he would say, I need to suck on a faggot. Well, that'll raise your eyebrows nowadays. But back then, even I didn't think that was weird, because back then we called, people called cigarettes faggots. I have no idea why. That's just what they, that was the slang of the day. They were talking about a cigarette. And so if they said, I need to suck on a faggot, he meant somebody hand me a cigarette. And somebody would hand him a cigarette. Life is like that, language is like that. The things that we say now are not, don't necessarily have the same meaning they did in the past. And so a lot of that happens with the Bible. I've totally forgotten why I brought that up in the first place. But anyway, let's get started with 11. Well, wait a minute. Let me see if there's something I wanted to talk about at this point. The Jubilee. That'll be returned to his possessions. No, I got a little book here in my lap that I'll get to in a little bit. Okay, so very literally, verse 11 says, Jubilee she, years the 50th year shall be to you, not you seed they, and not you reap they, grow it, and not shall gather they, separated it. Okay, so our first word being Yovel. I can actually see where you would get the word Jubilee from this, because we're looking at something called transliteration. If I translate a word and I say like Yovel, how about that one? Let's translate the word Yovel. Well, it means ram's horn, very literally. But when they spoke of Yovel, they were mostly talking about a trumpet, blowing a trumpet, because they made trumpets out of ram's horns. And just like I showed you last week, that's a trumpet. People blow into this end, sound comes out of that end. So we say trumpet in our modern times. Try not to make that fall. But shofar is a more common word for the idea of a horn that's being blown and all that kind of stuff. But Yovel is one of those words. It's the ram's horn. So now that's translation. I'm telling you what that word means. But if I say transliteration, I am going to put the letters from our alphabet, from whatever language we happen to be speaking. If it's Chinese, they're going to use those letters. If it's looking for some other languages, no, because English, Spanish, Italian, all of those are using the same alphabet. Well, for that matter, so does German. Russian, there's one that's real different. So you got Chinese and Russian. Their letters are quite different, though. A lot of the Russian letters look like ours because they took them from the same place, but you notice there's some very different ones, right? So why would we do that? Why would we just, put these different letters? Because in Hebrew, Yovel is spelled Yod, Vav, Beit, Lamed. That's the names of the letters, like we would say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And so we take the Yod and we put a Y. Vav, in this case, we'll put a U. The Beit, we'll put a B. And the Lamed, we'll put an L. So already you see this could be Yo Bell or U Bell. But then that's the way it would have been early on in the English language, because we didn't have the letter J until right after the time of the King James Bible. I mean, we're talking 40 or 50 years later, after that Bible comes out in 1611, then we really start using this J. And when it started off, it made the Y sound like a Y. And so when we transliterated a Yod that made the Y sound, we began replacing what used to be a Y with a J. So then the J over time lost its Y sound and became J. So you go from Yubel to Jubel, right? And since you want to make it plural, Jubilee. So the information that you get from the Jewish Study Bible about where that word came from is utterly wrong. This is a transliteration of a Hebrew word, Yovel. Anyway, that's to blow a ram's horn. And then the word is heave, the next one, which means literally she, but that's the feminine in Hebrew for the word it, it. It is a good day, it. But we say the word she, heave is she in Hebrew, in place of it if it's feminine, and who in place of it if it's masculine. Anyway, our next word is shenat, which means years in plural. Then we have ha-chamishim. Well, that's the 50th. So we have in the 50th shana, in the 50th year. So we have years, the 50th year. Tia, which means it shall be. It goes from it will be to it shall be. Moving on, lachem, it shall be to you. Speaking of the Jews, the book was written by Jews, to Jews, concerning matters of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people. Nobody else was included in this book as far as who the book is to and about. Of course, they do talk about other people, but it's all about Judaism. So then it says lo, which means not. Tizera'u. Literally, that's you seed they. So it's your seed, their seed. Velo, and not zikzeru, and not reap. So what's it saying? You don't seed and you don't reap. Well, how do we say it? You don't sow and you don't harvest, right? You're not supposed to do that. Then it says et, which is just like drawing an arrow. This word has no meaning. It just points to something. Then it says seficheha. That's growth. It's really saying grow it. Something poured out, pouring. And why do they say that? Well, it's corn growing spontaneously. It wasn't planted, but it's just pouring out onto the land all on its own. That's going to happen because when you harvest a field, seeds that are in whatever you're harvesting will fall to the ground. And what's not eaten by the birds and that sort of thing will actually grow the next year. It won't be like it grows when you're planting a field, but there will be residual stuff that will grow up that following year. So it's talking about that. This is velo, so and not. Tivzeru. You don't gather that up. The stuff that flows out from the ground. So that wild stuff growing on the ground, you don't gather it. It's got to stay there. Then it says et, pointing at something else, nezireha. This is where we get the word Nazarite. And the people who let their hair grow really long, their beards grow, and they don't drink alcohol. And I'm practically a Nazarite. I fit all of those. I don't drink alcohol. My hair is long and my beard's long. This is actually the word for Nazarite. But so you have to understand there's an idiomatic usage here. They're not talking about Nazarites. They're not going to grow out of the ground, if you know what I mean. So anyway, our translation, it will be to you a Yovel, a Jubilee year. It'll be to you a Jubilee year. The 50th year, of course. You will neither sow nor reap. You will neither plant nor harvest. The unplanted produce nor gather of the uncut. And it just ends with uncut. So what's uncut? The crops and the vines. You have to cut them to harvest them. So of course that's what it's talking about. So you're not allowed to plant anything in this year. You're not allowed to harvest anything in this year. So until this point in this chapter, we've been told that we can neither sow nor reap, but this verse just added that we cannot gather the wild crops or the fruit that grows on those vines, because it's not exactly wild. That fruit's, the grapes on your grapevines are going to come back that next year, assuming you get enough rain. You're not allowed to cut any of that down. You got to leave it alone. All right. Okay. I'm going to save it for this one. So let's look at verse 12. It says, very literal English, for Jubilee, she, of course, it, holy, it is holy, shall be to you from the field. You shall eat the crop. What? We're going to have to talk about this, right? So it's Ki Yovel, which is for Jubilee or because Jubilee, you know, like as in because it's a year of Jubilee. He, which is it, Kodesh, because the Jubilee is holy. It is set aside for God. It has to be set aside for God or it's not holy. So you cannot go fishing on Sabbath and say that you're keeping the Sabbath holy. In order for it to be holy, you have to set that day aside for God. You have to go to synagogue. I don't say anything about Christianity. They can do what they want. So then it's Tiya, it shall be, Lachem, to you. Then it says mean, which is from Ha-Sadeh, from the field. It should be to you from the field. Tochlu, you shall eat they. That sounds a lot like it's telling you got to eat this. It's from achal, is your root word here, which is to eat, to devour, and that sort of thing. So, we have some more words here. Et tevu ata, you will devour that crop. This sounds like we're arguing against ourselves, doesn't it? For it is a jubilee. It is holy to you. You will eat from the produce of the fields. Wait, doesn't this verse say we're supposed to eat the wild food? And haven't I been teaching you otherwise? But again, how on earth will we eat from the field if we can't plant, reap, or gather? Oh, I know. We got to go into the field and just eat our food in the field every day. Well, up until this point, Moshe has left us completely in the dark. It sounds like he's arguing with himself. It sounds a lot like the Apostle Paul, if you ask me. The Torah is holy and perfect and pure, and don't follow it. At least if you read the English translation, right? So I'm going to, try to pull us out of the darkness here and toss us forward a little bit and look at verses 20, 21, 22. My translation, of course. Verse 20. What will we eat in the 7th year? Behold, we will not sow, nor will we gather our crops. Why? If this verse means you may eat of that food, would God say, here's what you're going to say, because this is God saying, telling the people what they're going to say before they say it. What will we eat in that 7th year? Behold, we will not sow, nor will we gather our crops. Here's what God had to say about that. But I, Yahweh, will command my blessing for you in the 6th year and cause 3 years worth of crops to grow. And you will sow in the 8th year and eat from the old. What's the old? Well, that's the triple year crop in the 6th year. There's 3 years worth of food coming out of that ground in year 6. And so in year 7, you're going to eat from the old, from the food that came up in the 6th year. And it says you'll eat from that crop until the 9th year, until the new crop you plant in the 8th year, because you're not planting or doing anything in the 7th. So you're going to plant it in the 8th. Well, the food's not going to come up until a little bit later, right? It's going to take a while. So you're going to eat of that crop until the 9th year, until the new crop from the 8th year comes up. You will eat the old, the food from the year number 6. All right. So what's happening here? It sounds like Moshe is telling us not to eat this stuff. God's saying they're going to say, what are we supposed to eat? And yet, when you translate this text, it says you will eat from the produce of the field. Let me show you something here. I pulled up my old Jewish study Bible this morning, and they have a commentary. While its produce may be gathered and eaten by the landholder. So they're telling you in this book that this verse means that if you own the land, you can eat from it. Everybody else is on their own. Under number 6, it says normal wholesale reaping and harvesting is not permitted. Rather, the landholder may gather as needed in order to feed his own household, and his livestock may graze, even though prior to this it said not so much. They say it is not known whether the Jubilee was ever observed in actual practice. There is no mention of the Jubilee in biblical history of the First Temple times, and according to the rabbis, it was not observed in the Second Temple times. So if you read your Jewish commentary, in spite of the fact that God himself said you're going to ask, what are we going to eat? You're reading this and you're still saying, see there, we can eat the food. This is really common with Judaism because they've lost one of the most important rules of Hebrew, of biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew does not contradict itself. It does not change subject in mid-sentence. It does no such thing anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. And by the way, the same thing can be said of the New Testament. I can say that because I've translated the Greek text. I didn't go in and take an English text and rewrite it so it would say it the way I want it to read. I went in and took the Greek text and translated every last Greek word from word 1 till the very last word. I translated the whole thing, and I can tell you it does not contradict itself. Bad translation by bad translators, there you get your contradictions. Anyway, so what's happening here? If you recall, I've already talked about this, but if you haven't caught any of the earlier teachings on this chapter, the reason why that land is to be left alone, the reason why that food is to grow out of the ground and neither you nor your animals eat it is so that that wild stuff that comes out of the ground will die, fall over, and rot into the ground and replenish that ground with the nutrients it needs so that you have a good crop for the next 6 years. If you keep planting every year after year after year and you do not replenish the nutrients, after a while, nothing is going to grow there beyond some weeds here and there. That you're not going to get any crops, that's for sure. So you can either, get you a front end loader and a big old dump truck and go down to a river bottom somewhere and scoop up, because there's a lot of nutrients in the river bottoms. Scoop all of that up and bring it out and replenish the land that way, which is not what God said. Or you can leave it for a year, not touch it, and not eat it. And then by doing that, you will continue to eat from the field. It doesn't say you're eating from the field in that year. You've already been forbidden to do that. It's saying that if you, by leaving that and not touching anything in that 7th year, you will continue to eat of that field. In other words, if you don't give it that Sabbath year, that 1 year every 7th year, if you don't allow that to just do what it does without you touching or eating or doing anything with it, those fields are not going to continue to produce food for you. Because, especially back then, they didn't have front end loaders and big dump trucks. Okay. Let's go on to verse 13. Very literal. In years, the Jubilee, this, shall return they man to possession he. Now we're going to find out why Jubilee really is an exciting time, even though the Jewish Study Bible says not. Our first word, Bishana. And again, I pronounce these words the way they would have been pronounced way back then, not the way they are slurred now. But anyway, so we have Bishanat is in the years, because that's from Shana, but it's in plural. Then it says Ha-Yovel, so in the Jubilee years, because, it's going to happen every 50th year, so it's going to be in plural, right? So in those years, Hazo, this or these, in these Jubilee years, Tashuva shall return they, to turn back, to return. It's what you think of in English. Something's going to be returned. We haven't been told what that is just yet, but something is to be returned. And then it says, Ish. A man is to be returned, or perhaps something is to be returned to the man. You've got to keep reading the sentence to find out. Then it says El, which means to. It's spelled and sounds exactly like the word they use for God, but in this case, it's T-O, return this guy to that place. How's that? T-O. Then we have Ahuzato. That's to his possessions. Literally, it's possessions but it's to his possessions, the things that belong to him. So our translation, in this Yovel, this Jubilee year, you shall return a man's property to him. You can say it either way. You can return a man to his property, or you can say return a man to his property, right? It means exactly the same thing. So it doesn't matter which way you want to write that sentence out. So this man is, what belongs to him will be returned to him, or he'll be returned to what belongs to him. Why would I say it both ways? Well, because if you've been forced into indentured servitude, in the Jubilee year, it's over on the day of Yom Kippurim, right? That's when it starts. It's over that day. And in that day, if he's working for you, you have to let him go back home to the land and the home that belongs to him. So your debt is paid, regardless of whether you got it all back or not, doesn't matter. Well, now you've got 50 whole years to work out getting repayment. So if you waited so far back in time that you can't get all of that worked off, that's kind of on you, isn't it? Anyway, our next verse, very literal. And for shall sell they, lease they, from lease to people's you, or acquire from hand people's you, not shall wrong they man kinsman his. This is awesome. The key, so and for and because, tin keru. Again, we say sell in English in the English Bibles, and that may have been right back in the time of King James and those guys. It's not right now, because now when we sell something, it belongs to somebody else. This is not talking about all sales are final. This is talking about a lease, literally a lease. The verses even say that they're his possessions. He sold it and somehow it's still his. No, he didn't sell it. He leased it. We really need to think of changing that word so people will understand what's going on here. And because people will lease me nakar, it's really from leasing or from lease, la'a mi techa, to people, because they'll lease things to people, even themselves. And this is the Hebrew word o, which means or in English, this or that. Kano, acquire. That's more like a purchase there. Not exactly. To acquire for oneself is to obtain something. Now that can be through a purchase, like you literally paid money for that candy bar, so you have acquired a candy bar. But it's also of redemption. If somebody pays somebody else's bill, they have acquired that person's freedom from that bill, if you will. If they acquire that, if that person's debt is caused by him leasing out his land and his house, and some family member comes along and pays off that debt, they have acquired that man's house and his property for him. They don't get it. The person who it belongs to, who leased it out, it goes back to that person, not the person paying it off, if we're talking about someone who's actually redeeming. Okay? So acquisition does not necessarily mean ownership. To acquire something, this is miyad, from the hand. Okay, you got to know this is an idiom. It's not saying somebody handed you something, therefore you acquired it. No. If you have been forced into servitude, in the biblical world, in the Hebrew mind, you are now turned over to the hand, the power of whoever you owe that money to. So if you have acquired someone by hand, that means that they've been forced to work for you because they owe you money. Or let's say you're working for some guy because you owe him money. Another person could come along and potentially, now that we're not going to find that in this chapter, but potentially another person could come along and buy out what's owed, that debt that you still owe from the person you're working for, and then you would have to work for him instead. That is possible. It's not in this chapter, but it is possible. Anyway, then our next word, ami taha, that's from people, right? So it's people's you. And this word people is a very limiting word. You could say that if you're Jewish, your people are the Jews. But those Jewish people, born and raised here in America, can say that our people are Americans. If you've been in the military, I was in the Air Force, I could say that the Air Force are my people. It would be probably wrong of me to say the Marines are my people, right? But then again, if I'm connecting it to the idea of military, an all-encompassing word, I could say the military is my people, right? Because that would indicate that I still hang out with all military people and do things with the military and, still involved in all that. And I'm not, so I wouldn't be considered that. But I would certainly be considered, my people would be considered Jewish, and my people would be considered American both. So, but it is limiting to whatever you really have a connection to. So if you live in the land of Israel back in these days, back in the Bible times, your constitution, we have a constitution of the United States. Well, Israel back then had a constitution. It was called the Torah. That was their constitution. That was the law of their land. So for you to be the people of God, the people of Israel, the Yehudi, the Yehudim in plural, you had to live according to God's law. If you didn't do that, you weren't considered their people. Anyway. Then we have the word all, which in this case is used as not. It's a sound-alike word, not spelled the same in this case, but it's a sound-alike. And we have tonu, which is shall, wrong, they. So we have all tonu, you shall not wrong them. This word is from the idea of acting violently, to oppress. In some of the passages in the Bible, it is used of an epithet for a sword, to oppressing or violence by a sword, right? And so you're not going to wrong these people. And then it says ish, well, that's literally who you're not supposed to wrong. And it says et achim, I have kinsmen here, but your brothers. Ach is the root word here, brother, and then this is brother. The Eve at the end makes it his brothers. When used in the sense that's not quite strict, it is applied also to those who are not your own brothers. It could be used of the children where they have the same father but a different mother, or vice versa, that sort of thing. It can be used of adopted brothers, military, the guys that get down there in the trenches and fight wars together call themselves brothers, right? There's a lot of different ways that word can be used. But remember, this is the law of God. We are talking about Torah observant Jews and nobody else. And by the way, if you were Egyptian, and you were in Israel, living a totally Torah observant life, that made you a Jew. Being Torah observant is what makes you a Jew. Being related to Abraham, not so much. It just doesn't work that way. Abraham wasn't even a Jew in the first place. The father of the Jews, he was a Hasdai, they call him Chaldean these days, right? What made him a Jew? He obeyed God. God's children, the Yehudi, the Yehudim in plural, they obey God. That's what makes them Yehud, followers or imitators of God. So our translation, and if you lease merchandise, the mimachar, I'm just put merchandise. That's the best way to say it. It can be your house, your land, whatever. To your amit. Am in plural. Those are your Torah observant people. And I don't know how I can get this across uh, any better than the fact that this is the law of the land of Israel that we're studying. If you lived in the land of Israel, it didn't even matter if you believed in God or wanted to live according to God. You lived under his law because that was the law of that land. You follow what I'm saying to you here? So it's about Torah observance. At least at this point, you can't get around that. So if you've leased some of your merchandise, something that you own, to your Torah observant peoples, or acquire an eye servant, is what I've been calling it, an indentured servant, from the hand, you've acquired this person because they owe you money, of your Torah observant people, because remember, everybody there is supposed to be Torah observant. Everybody. A man shall not take advantage, he shall not wrong, take advantage of his brother, his Torah observant relative. And it doesn't really have to be a relative either, does it? Because if you're in that land and you're living by God's law, then it's somebody Torah observant. This is all for the Jews, by the Jews, to the Jews, and of the Jews. It has nothing to do with anyone but the Jews. That's what this book is for. We cannot purchase something from a family member, someone of the same race or religion, a friend or someone connected to us in any way. This is all encompassing here, our people, for less than what it is worth. Whether that person doesn't know the value or is just desperate makes no difference. We cannot take advantage of him. We cannot wrong him. God is comparing this to violence, and the kind of violence of somebody killing people with a sword. That's how God sees his children taking advantage of other of his children. He compared it to the violence of a sword. Keep in mind here that the subject is how we are to conduct ourselves in the land of our God, the land that he gave us as an inheritance. vaYiqra by Drauzine and Wagner says, Rashbam said, a person cannot actually sell the land itself, only the harvest, which is pretty close to true, but not quite. Because that land is, for all intents and purposes, and probably the reason why the word sell was used, it's yours. You're going to do with it whatever you want to do with it the way you want to do it once you lease that land. The seller does not make the terms, the buyer does. And it's probably why they use the word sell in English, because they wanted to get that point across that the seller had no say in it. But the Bible's still calling it the possession of the person who leased it. All right. So verse 15, very literal again. With number years after the Jubilee shall acquire from people's you, with number year crops he sell or lease to you. So we have Beth Mispar, which is in or with number, the word number. So in that number or with that number, we'll find out exactly what they mean here in a minute. Shani. So with the number of years, ahar, after, ha yovel. What's it saying here? Well, it's telling you that if a field is to be leased, you do not pay for 50 years if you're in the 25th year. You're going to deduct the first 25 years and lease it for the next 25 at most. Right? That's what's happening here. Then it says tikne, so you're acquiring it through this lease. Me'et, which is just from and then pointing to something. Amitecha, from your people. So does that mean that foreigners cannot acquire this property? Yeah, it does. Because if a person from another country comes into Israel and lives according to the law of God and converts to Judaism, if you will, of the biblical version anyway, that person becomes your people. If the person is, living in some other country, say Italy or whatever, America, doesn't matter, and they just want to lease your land so that they can grow something on your land and ship it off to their country, no, you're not allowed to do that. Not by God's law. It's your people. And it says be mispar, so that's with number, shenei tevuot, with the number of years of crops. So we already know to deduct, we can only go by the years that are left till the Jubilee, and you're paying for crops, you follow. It's why crops is being brought up, because we're going to have to set the price according to what the crops will sell for. Yi mechar, and this, the price of the sale of the crops, lach, to you. So here we have, according to the number of years after the Jubilee, he shall acquire from your Torah observant peoples according to the years of crops he leased to you. Okay, that limits it. So if there are just 25 years left and he only leased it to you for 4 years, you're not paying for the whole 25. You're just paying for the 4. This really got lost in much of the translation that I looked over in English. I'm not even sure why I bother looking anymore, because anyway. The words, according to the number of years after the Jubilee, he shall acquire from your Torah observant peoples, teaches us that property cannot be leased until after a Jubilee begins. In other words, the number of years after. We know that a lease cannot last beyond the beginning of the next Jubilee, since verse 13 clearly states that our property must be returned to us in the Jubilee year. Thus, we know that a property lease must be set for 40 years or less. There's that 50. Where did I write there? 50 years. I said 40 and thought, what? It does say 50. I wrote it. I should have known. But so it's 50 years or less. You cannot have there is no lease that can go beyond that. Further, if 5 years have passed since the Jubilee, the maximum number of years that a lease can be entered into is 45. Pretty simple, right? This means that if 30 years have passed since the last Jubilee, a 25-year lease cannot be entered into, since there are only 20 years left until the next Jubilee. Hopefully this is making it clear, not convoluting it. Thus, these words are meant to place limits on the leases. The limits determine the years a property can be leased and the maximum length of time a lease can be entered into. The words, according to the years of crops he leased to you, clearly show that a lease can be any agreed upon number of years. Any agreed upon, as long as they fall within the parameters, which are what's left and what's the most you can do. It's got, as long as it falls within those parameters, it can be any number of years. This restriction ensures that no one will lease a property beyond the next Jubilee and subsequently lose money when they are forced by law to return the property to the owner without reimbursement. Think about it, 50 years. If you grew up in Israel and your father took care of everything until he was 70 years old, and at 70 he leased something that's going to go, past the Jubilee, and you haven't been paying attention, you're not as religious as your dad, you stay within the law, but you're not so worried about God so much and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, you got this money coming in from the crops every year, and then suddenly someone starts blowing some horns and saying, "Oh, by the way, you got to give up that land." Going to be pretty upset, aren't you? So God's kind of keeping that from happening. Let's see. There are at least two obvious advantages to these restrictions. First, anyone who has sold his property or leased his property for whatever reason knows that he and or his children, maybe he's so old he won't get to see this, but he and his children will one day be returned to their family inheritance. It's not just gone. That is to say, God's people are not left hopeless, even if the parents were terrible with money. Second, no one who has leased a property will be shorted at the end of their contract, because it's not allowed. God doesn't allow that to happen. The price per year is set according to the estimated maximum amount of money the crop will sell for in a single year. We're going to get to that. We haven't seen that yet, but this is what it says. The amount estimated is then multiplied by the number of years agreed upon in the lease, but not to exceed the beginning of the next Jubilee. Thus, if a crop is estimated to sell for $500 per year and the lease is set for 10 years, the equation is $500 times 10 years equals $5,000. It's kind of hard to rip somebody off when everybody knows the figures before the thing is even entered into. And your dad can't have passed away, and then you come in and say, "Now, what was the deal?" And the guy, "Oh, well, it was figured at $200 a year," so he doesn't have to. So you have to pay more? Nope. Everybody knows, or at least everybody should. All right, that's as far as I can take this week. Shalom, shalom, everybody.
The blessing, vaYiqra. Yevarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.